So we are approaching the finish line now. It's a really great pleasure to be able to welcome to the stage a good friend of mine, Air Marshal Rich Knighton. I couldn't find a 1980s pop star that sort of was even remotely close to that name. Rich is DCDS military capability, an engineer by trade, spent time on the Nimrod, Tornado and Harrier forces. Then moved on to the Harrier IPT before becoming the military assistant to DCDS equipment capability. He was the RAF's logistics force commander and station commander at Wittering, and then from that point moved basically into MOD and Air Command in a variety of strategic and planning capability type roles. Thank you very much for agreeing to close the conference. We really look forward to what you've got to say.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. It is a great pleasure to be here on what is my very last day as the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff for Military Capability. The handover is done, and this is pretty much my last act. And I've been with Lieutenant General Rob McGowan, who is taking over from me for the last day and a half. So I have had to follow the conference by Twitter, which always carries with it some risk. But it is a matter of great pride to me to listen to what's been going on at the conference. And I think back to when I started in this job in January of 2019, and the position we were in was really not very healthy. We had Rocky versus JP, those will know who that is. We had Stratcom versus Air Command. And we had some pretty, frankly, crazy ideas about how we would spend money we didn't have on things we probably didn't need. Where we stand now, we have a structure, we have a strategy, we have a funded plan, and we know where we're going. And that is as a consequence of work that we've done over the last 2 years across the community and across the enterprise to deliver that sort of certainty in that plan. And I feel really proud to be stood here on my final day as DCS MilCap, having set up the the Space Directorate in the Ministry of Defence to lead that work, and for it to actually then be delegated back out to Air Command and elements to Strategic Command so that we can actually get on and deliver the space capability that our warfighters are going to need into the future. So I've got two tasks today. Could you go back one slide, please? The first, when it comes up, I've got two tasks today. One is to get control of this. Maybe a third task. Go back one slide, anybody? Oh, maybe I can do it. This is going to create... There we go. The first is to talk about what's on the screen here, remaining allied and resilient through an own collaborate access lens to ensure operational success. I didn't really know what that meant either when I was asked to talk about it. And I'll talk about how I'm going to address some of these questions, and I think what will be interesting to the audience as we close. And the second thing is that I've been asked to close the conference because Lawrence Lee, our second and permanent secretary, was asked at the end of last week to go to Washington with the Defence Secretary. So he is currently there, and he's asked me if I would close, and he's very disappointed not to be here. And he'll play a key role, I think, in our thinking around science and technology and research and development as we go forward. So in order to deliver on both of those objectives, my approach is to examine the strategy in the context of what we've learned over the last few months. A strategy really ought to endure a little longer than 2.5 months since we published it on the 1st of, 3.5 months since we published it on the 1st of February. But a lot has happened since the 1st of February. And the context in which we're operating has changed. And you've heard in the conference firsthand what the implications are to those who are in a fight if they don't have access to space and where they do have access to space. Last week I was talking at the Sea Power conference. It's the season for it. And I was chatting to somebody and telling them I was coming here to talk to the space conference. And I was going to talk about the implications of the crisis and the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia at the space conference. And the gentleman I was talking to, who will remain nameless, said, well, it's about land and air, isn't it? Space has got nothing to do with that campaign. That's going to be tricky. And I think that really illustrates how far we have to go in terms of our education of our joint commanders on how we exploit space. I don't need to recap today about the importance and value of space as a domain to the fight in the future. But we do need to educate and train our people and our commanders of the future on how to do that, how to exploit space and understand space more effectively. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about really examine the three cross-cutting themes that was laid out in the strategy. I'll talk about the priorities that we laid out for investment in the strategy, and I'll then look at the impact on industry and the industrial sector of those changes, of the experience we have had over the last 3 months. And that will lead me on to a discussion around own, collaborate and access as a framework and the judgments that we need to make as we think through the consequences of our plans and how they might need to shift and change. So I'm going to start then with a little piece about the context and the drivers for the decisions we made in the integrated review and the plans that were laid out in the space strategy. And I know Harv talked a little bit about the strategic context earlier. But the integrated review concluded that we faced a world that was more unstable than we had seen for some time. There was a return of great power competition, and we were in an era of constant competition where our interests were being threatened both below and above the traditional threshold of warfare. And this was happening across all 5 operational domains. So beyond land, sea and air, but in cyberspace and in space. And taken together, the threats that we faced were starting to erode the operational advantage that the West had enjoyed for probably 30 years. The threats are to our freedom of manoeuvre. We've got adversaries who are prepared to escalate conflict horizontally and vertically across all 5 domains. And there's emergence of information warfare as a critical part of the outcome of any future campaign. Our intellectual response to that was the integrated operating concept. And at the heart of that was this idea that our armed forces, UK armed forces, would protect, engage, constrain and fight. And we needed to be able to operate across that full spectrum. The IOPC is a relatively straightforward document, but it's worth me pulling out the 4 key factors or characteristics that really drove our decision-making through the integrated review. The first is the absolute critical importance of deterrence. Now, I think deterrence in space is a fascinating topic of its own right, and that might be a topic for a future conference, it seems to me. Intellectually challenging, difficult to necessarily understand the calculus of our adversary. But right at the heart of it, if you really want to deter, you need to know what's going on. So from our perspective, a priority around space domain awareness in order to inform that thinking around how we deter our adversaries in space. The second key aspect of the IOPC is this idea of persistent engagement. The idea that more of our forces will be deployed more of the time in more places around the world. And if we're going to do that, we're going to need to be able to communicate with them reliably. So this really drove us to think about the remaining priority and continued priority of strategic communication. And I'll talk about SATCOM and strategic SATCOM in a little while. The third component of the IOPC is this idea of integration or multi-domain integration. This is not about integration for its own sake. This is about integrating across all the 5 operational domains to enable, to orchestrate swift, integrated action, to enable a commander to outmaneuver, outthink, and fundamentally unhinge our adversaries. Thinking about how we integrate space into our operational planning, into our tactical thinking, and how we exploit the opportunities that we get from the capability we have in space and from space is, for me, a key challenge across the defence community over the next few years. And then the final component of the IOPC that I want to draw your attention to is this idea of adaptability. There's a recognition that some of our operational advantage was being eroded in a way I described. And we recognised that actually, as commercially available technology became available, it was becoming increasingly possible for non-state actors and nations that were not superpowers to have this ability to get access to technology and capability that they could then proliferate, that would undermine our own operational advantage. And what we needed to be able to do was adapt our own capability quickly. And that was part of the evidence that underpinned, an argument that underpinned our much increased investment in research and development through the integrated review. So what I want to do now is go and talk a little bit about the priorities. But just before I do, let me just comment on the remarkable shift we have seen, particularly in space, around the exploitation of commercial technology and this huge capital flow that's gone into space over the last few years. And I saw the chart that was shown on the screen yesterday, and that sort of inflection point in the mid-1990s, where we saw actually that the drive of the technology was more coming from the commercial world than it was coming from government. And I'll return to that later. Now, a lot of that has been driven by billionaires, as you will have talked about. When my children asked me, did I know what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said, yes, absolutely. I wanted to be an astronaut, and I still do. And so when ESA decided that they were going to run a competition to find the next astronaut, I decided I'd apply. And you can imagine my disappointment after about half an hour of going through filling in the form to find that I was actually the wrong side of the age limit to be able to apply. So I've concluded that the only chance of me now becoming an astronaut is to become a billionaire. I'm not entirely sure that I'm in the right profession to do that. But my point is, though, that this shift we have seen in terms of the way in which capital is being exploited to develop technology that we are able to then access and potentially exploit in a defence perspective is really my point here. So let me go on to talk about these priorities then. And these are the cross-cutting principles that we set out in the space strategy. So the first of these was this idea of broadening and deepening multinational collaboration. The week before I was speaking at the space conference, I was speaking at the SupportNet conference. As I say, it is the season for it. And I was asked to talk about what the importance of availability in thinking about defence. And I, as an engineer, as Mark explained, said, well, obviously availability is important to future military capability. And I feel a little bit like saying, well, broadening and deepening our multinational collaboration in space, well, it is obvious that we need to continue to do that. And I think what we have seen over the last few months has only reinforced the importance of international capability collaboration. And the conversation we had with the panel previously, I think really reinforced again the value that we will get through greater resilience by broadening out our the architecture, diversifying our architecture, and by improving the levels of interoperability that come through that international collaboration. But there is a tension, because if we're going to collaborate with our international partners, what that might mean is that we're not going to give that work to our domestic industries. And that tension is a question for industry and for government to think through. And I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. The second of our key principles laid out in the strategy was this idea of improving cross-government collaboration. And I have to say I'm really impressed and proud of the work that the team from BASE, our business department, and the MOD have done over the last 2 years to get to the position of a national space strategy that we both worked on together, and through the defence space strategy also worked together. Brilliant work by Harv Smith and his team, and Rebecca Eversden, who I know spoke to you yesterday. It seems to me that in space, the potential blurring of technology utility between civilian and military is greater here than it is in any other sector that I deal with. And so exploiting and cohering that civilian technology, pulling it through, exploiting the benefits of that huge capital flow into the space industry is something that we must do. It is about an enterprise, as we heard from the previous panel. The third key principle was this idea of driving innovation and exploiting technological opportunities. And what I wanted to do before is just talk briefly about the 7 priority areas that we identified in the defence space strategy. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but these are the 7 shown on the screen. I want to pick out a few just to reflect on what recent experience might tell us about whether our priorities were right. So let me start with secure SATCOM. This is fundamental to enabling military operations. Our analysis said that the GEO constellation would need to endure as a fundamental part of the backbone. But you heard from we've heard reports from Starlink's use in Ukraine. You heard from Volodymyr yesterday. The opportunity that low Earth orbit constellations might bring to improve resilience and for us to access it from a military perspective, even though they're civilian-owned constellations, seems to me to be an area that you need to explore. I spoke earlier about the importance of space domain awareness, and the opportunity, it seems to me here, is to collaborate multinationally and with our civilian counterparts to make sure that we have as full a picture of what's going on in space as we can, as far out as we can. Because without it, we won't know whether we are facing potential threats in space, and we will then not know how to deal with our own escalation to try and deter or defeat those threats as they come along. And the third element I just want to reflect on is intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, ISR. The additional funding in the defence space portfolio was largely focused on ISR capability. I think what you've heard at the conference over the last 2 days, what we've seen, says that there is an opportunity to exploit commercially available technology and products in a way that we knew it could be done, but we've not seen it done at such scale or in such speed. And I think that does raise some questions in our minds about what should be our balance between commercially available technology and product and that which we own in the military. So let me just finish then by turning to talk about the industry sector and the impacts that some of those judgments might have on our thinking and on you in industry. The Own, Collaborate, Access framework is helpful for us in thinking through how we might just make judgments and decisions about where we want to prioritise our investment. But it isn't binary. We have to make judgments. It's not at any cost that we will own something. It's about balancing a whole range of factors in terms of our military capability requirement, about the prosperity benefits, and about the resilience we might have from it. And the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy has this absolutely at its heart. It is not about a Buy British. It's not about propping up British industry. It's about making refined, sophisticated judgments based on a range of factors. So it's not just about military capability, as I said. But we do care about the capacity and competence of our industry. And I think we need to take a pretty hard and honest look at ourselves as we think through this. The current plan in the defence space portfolio is based on our best guess of where we need to invest to balance those factors, such as military capability, prosperity, resilience, and industrial capacity. But if we learn something over the next few years, both through our experimentation, through what we've seen in Ukraine and what we see in space every day, then we should change our plans. And there's a key moment in the mid-2020s before we make a big commitment to an ISR constellation that we need to think through what we want to do at that stage. But I feel absolutely passionately that this needs to be a joint discussion. This is not a decision that defence government can make on its own. I'm also cautious about imagining that it is only about exploiting new commercially available technology. The labs, defence and government spending has got a part to play. And we need to make sure that we're investing that money in the right areas. And we'll only understand that if we can have that open dialogue. And so the highest priority for the work of my Space Directorate over the next few months is to work with the business department, with BAES, to understand what that space sector strategy might look like. So I'm going to finish and leave time for questions. I said at the start I was proud of how far we'd come over the last few years. I really am, and the conference really illustrates how far we've come. But there is a lot more to do. War always accelerates the pace of change. And we've seen things that we've talked about played out in real time on our TV screens over the last few weeks. I think the international commitment to collaboration in space is stronger than I've known it in the last 5 years while I've been associated with it. I think broadly speaking, the priorities we laid out in a strategy only 3.5 months ago feel right. But we are seeing opportunities emerge and be exploited real time that I'm not sure we necessarily expected. And these are changing our risk judgments and the balance between what we own, what we collaborate, and what we access. As I mentioned, the industrial sector strategy, as I would call it, is, I think, a priority. That will help us to understand and will be how we deliver innovation. And it needs to be a joint discussion and an honest joint discussion about what skills we really have and how competitive industry really is. And we need the humility in government and on industry side to have that conversation properly. And I agree with what the panel said earlier. This is going to require a different judgment of risk between government and industry. And we need to work together to understand what that is. And we will inevitably move away from an entirely transactional approach, which is where we have been heading since we came out of cost-plus contracts in the 1980s. So I think it's an exciting time ahead. There are opportunities for us to adjust our path, and we should do that rather than slavishly follow it based on analysis that might be proven by events to be not quite right. And I look forward to doing that with you. I'll stop there and open it up for questions. I think, Mark, you're doing that.
Yes, well, we'll open the... thank you very much, Rich. That was really super a way to close the conference. And we will take some questions if there are any from the floor.
Hi, Rich. Sean O'Connor, you know me.
This is going to be a tough one, I know. Go on.
I'll go easy, honest. We've heard a lot about barriers to collaboration, both from defence into industry and internationally. 1.4 billion uplift is quite a considerable uptick. There's clearly going to be some deliverability challenges along that pathway. From your DCDS Millcap perspective, how can your successor help Space Command to be genuinely agile from capability development through capability management into operations, such that they can exploit the fleeting opportunities that we see day in, day out through things like Ukraine?
Thanks, Sean. So I'm on record as saying this in the Public Accounts Committee, so I'm not divulging major confidences here, but we have spent the last 25 years or so, maybe a bit less, creating an acquisition system and an approval system around it that was optimised for 20th century capability, and we're trying to apply that to deliver 21st century capability, and that won't work. So we have to think about the balance of performance, time and cost, and emphasise more time than we have tended to do in the past. Our system is optimised to some extent to preserve performance and keep us within the budget. And what new technology what technology in this arena and new technology requires us is to think about much faster cycles of enhancement and spiral development. And that requires us to, I think, judge risk in a different way and emphasise much more clearly the time that we undertake. And there's some really good work being done in MOD at the moment to remodel our acquisition and approvals system in order to move away from a kind of one-size-fits-all model to one that is much more tailored to the risk that we're undertaking and acknowledges that if you want to move fast, you might actually have to have a different risk profile. I don't think it necessarily, the evidence demonstrates that actually we carry any greater risk. It just emerges in a different way. And my argument would be, if you don't move quickly, you don't adapt fast, then you won't be able to, then actually the risk that you carry will be in capability and operational effectiveness. And that really, really matters. There's also an argument, I think, borne out in many places that moving fast actually doesn't necessarily mean it costs more, certainly over the long run. So that, for me, would be the key area of focus. Is that all right? Thanks, Sean.
Any more?
This one there.
Dave Davis, ST Engineering, iDirect. We've heard a lot at this conference about Allied by Design, about collaboration. If we get a repeat of something that happened 40 years ago, are you confident that the UK could stand alone and fight as its own force if needs be?
When you say 40 years ago, you're talking in the Falklands, I assume. Is that? Yeah. The short answer is yes. I have absolutely no question or doubt in my mind at all. In fact, I would argue the UK is better able to deal with that kind of threat than it was in the past. The history of the Falkland Islands conflict, though, would also say that we didn't entirely do it on our own, and we had friends and allies who supported us along the way, and I have no doubt also that that would be part of whatever the solution would be come that event. Is that okay? Thanks.
One more, I think.
Behind you.
Alan Thompson from Skyrora. Thank you very much for your presentation. There's a topic that's been, I noted at the last point on your list there, that has been mentioned by our colleagues from Ukraine, and a capability that we've discussed, whether it's assured or sovereign, but it's the topic of launch, which feels like it's very ambivalent. We're not sure whether the government really wants it. We understand that it comes into Space Command's programs, but in the form of a collaboration with the UK Space Agency. Simple question. What do you think we need to do to further embrace launch? Because at the moment we're very hesitant about how we are approaching it. We're not sure if it's going to happen. We're not sure if we have the SQEP in the country. We're trying to invest into it. We're still not sure. Critical capability. Are we doing this? How do we embrace it? I'm reading from your presentation that because it's the last point on your list, that it is a point that we are committing to. Just be interested to know. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. So a few things I'd say. So that list was, as set out in the strategy, a prioritised list in terms of what defence needs. I can absolutely assure you that the Prime Minister is completely committed to UK launch, and therefore his government and all of us in it are absolutely committed to UK launch. So there's no doubt or question in my mind. I think there are a few follow-on questions that we have to ask ourselves, which is, firstly, can we make UK launch commercially viable so that it can stand on its own 2 feet without being supported by government? And at the moment, the plan is to do that. And as you say, the UK Space Agency have got that plan. If you can do that, then the defence has access to a sovereign launch capability. Right now, we have as much access as we need to launch capability to deliver our programme. But there is an operational argument that says that a country might want to have responsive launch, in which case you may well want to have that on your own soil, and you may well want to do that in a way that gives you build that capacity to be able to do that. At the moment, that is not definitively in our plan. But I think we are a number of years away from having to make that judgment. But Defence will absolutely support UK Space Agency in its work to deliver a UK launch capability. And there is definitely an argument for, from a defence perspective, to to have sovereign launch. But it's one of those areas where there's judgment, as I described in Own Collaborate Access. And at the moment, we have access to all the launch we might need, whether it be in the UK or elsewhere. But I can definitively tell you that the Prime Minister is absolutely committed to UK launch. So please don't think there's any doubt about that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'd like to give you a couple of minutes last comments.
Thanks very much, Mark. So all I was going to say to finish off was an enormous thank you. So thank you to the Air and Space Power team for organising and running the conference. Thank you particularly to my team who've been working behind the scenes with you to put together what was a remarkable package over the last couple of days, and some brilliant speakers. And also, who was talking on the panel earlier, all the feedback I've had has been about how this conference has felt different and how it has been getting after really critical topics. I feel very proud, as I say, that we have got to a position where we have a clear defence space strategy, we have a funded plan. Our job now is to get after it and implement it. And these kind of conferences where we bring ourselves together with industry, with academia, with the military, and we work as an enterprise and we think about how we're going to do it as an enterprise, seems to me to be fundamental and vital to it. So to all of you who've been involved, Mark, your team, my team, everybody who's been here, contributed, and to all of the sessions, thank you. And I look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. I can't do better than that. Not unsurprisingly, my final comments were going to be exactly the same, so I'm not going to waste your time with repeating them. The only thing I would say, Anu, is I'm not sure for the next conference we'll get a 45-minute firework display, but we'll give it a very good try. See you next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.